They called me a nobody, a placeholder with no story to tell, but they had no idea I was the architect who built the very world they live in. When I finally hit play on my secret archive, I didn't just expose my past, I triggered a total system collapse. The ballroom of the Grand Hotel was suffocating, a pressurized chamber of forced smiles and designer suits that felt like a costume I wasn't invited to wear. I stood by the buffet, nursing a lukewarm tonic water, watching my stepdaughter, Chloe, hold court near the center of the room. At 24, she possessed that sharp, cutting confidence that only comes from being raised in a house where money was the primary language. Beside her stood her boyfriend, a man whose tailored blazer cost more than my first car, and a group of her mother's high society friends. Honestly, Chloe's voice carried across the room, smooth and dismissive, my stepmother is just there. She's a placeholder. A nobody, really. Dad picked her up from some quiet, dusty life where she was used to being invisible. She doesn't have a pedigree. She doesn't have connections. And frankly, she doesn't have a story worth telling. She's just the background noise in a life that actually matters. A ripple of polite, cruel laughter followed. I felt the heat crawl up my neck, not from embarrassment, but from a familiar, cold spike of irony. I had spent 8 years being the quiet stepmother, the woman who kept the household running, who listened to Chloe's endless complaints about her allowance, and who remained silent while her father's new circles treated me like hired help. I had buried my past deep, choosing a life of anonymity over the chaotic brilliance of my youth. But hearing her label me as a nobody, a woman without a story, felt like a slap across the face of the girl I used to be. I took a steadying breath and set my glass down on the white tablecloth. As I began to walk toward the center of the room, my husband Richard caught my arm, his eyes wide with a warning flicker. "Honey, don't," he whispered, his voice frantic. "She's had a drink or two. Just let it go. We're leaving in an hour." I looked at him, then past him to where the hotel's massive projection screen was currently cycling through digital photos of the reunion's honorees, mostly boring shots of golfing trips and corporate board meetings. I reached into my clutch and pulled out the small, worn-out silver USB drive I had carried in my pocket since leaving the house. I had come prepared, though I hadn't been sure I would actually go through with it. I slipped away from his grasp and walked straight to the hotel's AV technician, who was busy scrolling through his laptop. "Excuse me," I said, my voice steady, cutting through the ambient hum of the party. "I believe there's been a technical error. The slideshow is missing the most important archives." The technician looked up, startled by the sudden intrusion. But before he could protest, I slid the drive into his port and typed in a sequence that belonged to a world he wouldn't recognize. "Wait," he stammered, his fingers freezing over the keys as the system began to override the playlist. "Ma'am, I'm not authorized to—" "Just press play," I commanded, my eyes locked on the screen. The ballroom lights dimmed automatically as the primary slideshow cut to black. A hush fell over the room, an expectant, confused silence that silenced Chloe mid-sentence. Then the screen flickered to life. It didn't show a golfing trip. It didn't show a corporate retreat. The first image was a grainy, high-contrast shot of a younger, fiercer version of me, standing on a stage that looked like it belonged to a stadium, surrounded by people who were currently the most powerful figures in the industry, all of them looking at me with undisguised awe. Chloe turned around, her glass freezing halfway to her lips, her face draining of all its color as the screen began to change. The image on the screen wasn't just a photograph. It was a digital restoration of a moment from 30 years ago, captured at the Global Innovation Summit. There I was, 22 years old, wearing combat boots and a grease-stained hoodie, standing in front of the proprietary mainframe that had eventually paved the way for the very digital infrastructure this hotel was currently using. My hair was a messy, bleached disaster, but my eyes, the same eyes Chloe claimed were invisible, were burning with a kind of brilliance that made the current tech moguls in the room look like toddlers playing with blocks. The room, which had been buzzing with gossip and the clinking of expensive crystal, turned into a graveyard. The only sound was the low, rhythmic hum of the projector. Chloe dropped her glass. It shattered against the marble floor, but nobody looked at her. They were all staring at the screen, and then, inevitably, they were staring at me. Is that the founder of Vesper Systems? A voice whispered from the back of the room. It was someone I recognized, a CEO who had spent the last decade trying to track down the ghost architect who had vanished from the public eye overnight. I stepped away from the AV station and walked toward the center of the floor, my heels clicking like a countdown. Chloe's friends were backing away, creating a path for me as if I were carrying a live grenade. Chloe herself looked like she'd been struck by lightning. Her mouth hung open, her composure completely shattered. She looked at the screen, then at me, then back at the screen, her brain clearly struggling to reconcile the nobody who made her dinner with the woman who had effectively built the foundation of the modern internet. "What is this?" Chloe hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and sheer terror. "This is a fake. Mom, tell her this is a fake. You hacked the system. You pathetic, desperate woman." I stopped a few feet from her, close enough to see the panic in her dilated pupils. I leaned in, my voice low and cutting through the suffocating silence of the room. "You wanted a story, Chloe. You wanted to know why I don't talk about my pedigree or my connections. You think I'm a placeholder? I'm the reason this hotel, this reunion, and that phone in your pocket even exist." The slideshow clicked to the next slide. It wasn't a photo this time. It was a document, a legal filing from 1998, signed by a name that hadn't been on a public record in 2 decades. It was my name. And right beneath it, a list of assets that, if adjusted for inflation, would have made every person in this room look like a charity case. "Dad." Chloe turned, her eyes desperate as she looked for an ally. "Dad, tell her to stop. Why aren't you saying anything?" Richard was standing by the pillar, his face an ashen mask. He wasn't looking at Chloe. He was looking at the screen, his hands balled into fists at his sides. For the first time in 8 years, the mask of the successful husband he wore had slipped. He wasn't looking at me with love or even irritation. He was looking at me with a cold, terrifying calculation. He stepped forward, but he didn't go to comfort Chloe. He walked directly toward the AV station, his eyes fixed on the drive still protruding from the laptop. "You promised," he said, his voice dropping into a register I had never heard before, a jagged, dangerous sound. "You promised you'd never open that vault. You said you'd leave that life dead and buried as long as I kept your secret." The entire room went deathly still. The CEO who had spoken earlier stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "Wait, you were the one who kept her secret? You were the one who hid her?" Richard didn't answer him. He lunged for the laptop, not to turn it off, but to see what was coming next in the folder. He hit a key, and the screen flashed bright red, a security override notification. A warning siren began to wail from the ceiling speakers, and the heavy security doors of the ballroom slammed shut with a final booming thud. The red security alert bathed the ballroom in a rhythmic, pulsing light that made everyone look like ghosts, trapped in a slaughterhouse. People began to scream, but the sound was muffled by the heavy, reinforced steel of the doors that had just locked us in. The AV technician was cowering under his desk, his hands over his ears, as the speakers emitted a sharp, high-pitched frequency that set teeth on edge. Richard was frantic, his fingers dancing across the keyboard, but the screen only flashed. "User permission denied. System re-engaging crypto lock." "Turn it off!" Richard roared at me, lunging toward my shoulder, his face twisted into something ugly and unrecognizable. "You stupid woman, do you have any idea what you've triggered? You didn't just out yourself. You tripped a kill switch that sends our location to every debt collector and rival you spent a decade running from. We had a life, a normal, quiet life." Chloe was backed against the wall, her designer gown ruined by the shards of her broken glass. She was sobbing, But it wasn't the spoiled tantrum of a girl losing a popularity contest. It was the raw, guttural fear of a girl realizing her world was made of glass. "What is he talking about?" she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Who are you? My father is a partner at a top-tier firm. Who are you, really?" I didn't look at Chloe. I didn't even look at Richard. I watched the progress bar on the screen as it crept toward 99%. My heart was beating a steady, cold rhythm. I had spent years in this quiet life, playing the part of the stepmother who didn't know how to use a microwave properly and who apologized when I bumped into furniture. I had done it to keep Richard happy. I had done it because I thought he was my safe harbor. But as the red light pulsed over his face, I saw the truth. Richard wasn't protecting me. He had been managing me, acting as the warden of a prison I had voluntarily built for myself, ensuring that my nobody status was maintained so that he could siphon off the dividends of the accounts I had forgotten existed. "You didn't keep my secret to protect me, Richard," I said, my voice cutting through the rising hysteria like a razor blade. "You kept me buried so you could be the only one with a shovel." Suddenly, the screaming in the room stopped. The red light vanished, replaced by a blinding, clinical white. The projector shut off and the speakers died, leaving us in a silence so heavy it felt like being underwater. Then the heavy steel doors didn't open. They hissed, a sound of hydraulics engaging. A shadow moved in the doorway. It wasn't the hotel security. They were men in charcoal suits, moving with the kind of synchronized lethal grace that only comes from deep state training. They didn't look at the crowd. They didn't look at the panicked guests. Their eyes were locked onto me with a chilling, professional familiarity. The lead man adjusted his earpiece and nodded toward me. "Project Vesper is active," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "The architect has been located." Before anyone could react, Richard grabbed my arm, his grip bruising. "Tell them," he hissed, his face desperate. "Tell them you're just my wife. Tell them you're a nobody. If they take you, I lose everything." I looked at his hand on my arm, then slowly looked up into his eyes. "You already lost everything, Richard," I whispered. "You just didn't realize that I was never the one being held captive." As the men crossed the floor, parting the terrified guests like a ship cutting through waves, the ballroom lights flickered once, twice, and then cut to absolute darkness. A cold metal object pressed firmly against the small of my back, and a voice whispered directly into my ear, "The board of directors has been waiting a very long time for your return. Don't make us carry you." The darkness lasted only a second, but it felt like a lifetime of sensory deprivation. When the emergency overhead lights flickered on, a sickly, sterile yellow, the ballroom had been transformed. The guests were huddled in the corners, some recording with their phones, others weeping into their napkins, while the men in charcoal suits held a perimeter that made the room feel like a tactical zone. The man who had pressed the barrel to my back didn't pull away. He was tall, his face a landscape of jagged scars and indifference. He looked at Richard, who was still clutching my arm as if I were a life raft. With a casual flick of his wrist, the man in the charcoal suit produced a collapsible baton and tapped Richard's hand. The sound of bone-meeting carbon fiber was sickeningly crisp. Richard yelped, collapsing to his knees and cradling his shattered fingers, but he didn't stop shouting. "She's insane! She's dangerous! You don't know who she is! She destroyed the legacy of the old guard! She's the one who blacklisted the board!" I didn't flinch. I straightened my posture, smoothing the fabric of the dress I'd chosen for a night of humiliation, not a night of liquidation. I looked down at my husband, my warden, with nothing but pity. "Richard," I said softly, "you always had a gift for projection. It wasn't my legacy that was destroyed. It was your ambition. You thought by hiding me, you were taming a titan. You were just feeding a ticking clock." Chloe had crawled toward us, her mascara running in black rivers down her cheeks. She was staring at her father, watching the man she thought was the apex of power, groveling in the dirt. "Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking. What did he mean? The architect? What is he talking about?" The lead agent stepped between us, ignoring her. He turned his attention to me, his gaze scanning my face with a terrifying analytical intensity. "The board is concerned about the timing, architect. You've been dormant for 8 years. To suddenly reappear in a public forum, it's considered a breach of the containment protocol. We were told you were settled." "I was," I replied, my voice steady, "until the settled life became a cage. I'm done with the containment." The man tilted his head, a ghost of a smirk touching his lips. "The board doesn't like loose ends, and they certainly don't like when their property tries to negotiate terms." He signaled to 2 of his men. They moved toward Richard, grabbing him by his tuxedo lapels and hauling him to his feet. Richard began to struggle, his face purpling with rage. "You can't do this. I have influence. I have friends in the Senate. You can't just take me." "Influence," the agent said, checking his watch, "is a currency that just devalued significantly." He looked back at me. "The board has issued an order. Since you've broken your silence, there are only 2 ways this ends. You return to the fold and restore the mainframe, or we burn everything you've touched to the ground, starting with this building and everyone inside it." I felt the blood drain from my face. My eyes darted to the exits, but they were swarming with more of these tactical units. Then my eyes fell on the screen, which had begun to flicker again. But this time it wasn't my old photos. It was a live feed of my own home, our private estate, showing the doors being kicked in by an identical team. "My daughter," I whispered, the first crack in my armor finally showing. "She's an anomaly," the agent said coldly. "Just like your husband, a distraction that served its purpose. But your time is up." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Choose, architect, the return or the ruins." Before I could answer, a massive explosion rocked the hotel from the floor below, sending a shockwave through the ballroom that threw everyone to the ground. The ceiling tiles rained down like shrapnel, and the power grid shrieked as it finally gave out. In the pitch blackness of the total failure, a red laser sight danced across the agent's chest, then shifted to my own. A voice, cold and synthesized, boomed over the hotel's emergency PA system, overriding everything. "Subject 16 has been compromised, initiating total system purge in 60 seconds. The countdown started not on the screens, but in our heads. The silence that followed the explosion was absolute, save for the rhythmic, mechanical pulse of the emergency system's death rattle. 58. 57. I realized then that I hadn't been the one to trigger the purge. The board had initiated it themselves, a fail-safe designed to prevent the architect from ever being captured by the rivals currently closing in. They would rather level an entire city block than let their most valuable asset fall into enemy hands. Richard was sobbing on the floor, clinging to his mangled hand, while Chloe had curled into a fetal position behind the buffet table. I felt a surge of cold, singular clarity. For 8 years, I had been an observer in my own life. Now I was the only one in the room with the access codes to the reality we were living in. I reached into my clutch one last time. I didn't pull out a phone. I pulled out a thin, flexible, conductive film, a bypass key I had spent 3 years stitching into the lining of my purse, just in case the normal life ever went south. I slammed it against the base of the nearest support pillar, tapping a rhythm into the concrete that would override the hotel's internal security network. 30 seconds. The agent in front of me saw what I was doing and lunged, but he was too slow. I kicked the base of the pillar, and the floor beneath us hummed with a violent electric vibration. The tactical men froze as their own gear, their comms, their HUDs, their lethal weapons, suddenly locked into an override loop. The red lasers dancing on my chest flickered and died. "What did you do?" the agent hissed, his voice finally betraying a spark of genuine fear. "I didn't just build the mainframe," I said, stepping over the debris and walking toward the center of the room. "I built the back doors into the back doors. Every system the board touches is a house of cards I stacked myself, and I've just revoked their lease." 15 seconds. I knelt down beside Chloe. She was shivering, staring at me with eyes that no longer saw a nobody, but a force of nature she couldn't comprehend. I took her hand. It was cold, trembling, and entirely human. "Close your eyes," I commanded. She obeyed. I looked at the AV tech who was still huddled under the desk. "Get to the stairwell now, take the staff access key you're hiding in your pocket, and don't look back." He scrambled up, wide-eyed, and vanished into the shadows. I stood up and looked at Richard, who was watching me with a mixture of terror and a pathetic, lingering greed. "You're not coming, are you?" he wheezed. "I'm leaving this life, Richard. The version of me you married was a script. The real one is checking out." 5 seconds. I activated the final sequence on my bypass key. I didn't stop the purge, I redirected it. Instead of a localized detonation, I pushed the surge through the hotel's fire suppression system. The ceiling erupted, not with fire, but with a massive high-pressure release of halon gas and a cascading failure of the magnetic locks on every door in the building. The ballroom walls groaned and swung outward. They were automated partitions designed for reconfiguration. In a heartbeat, the room disintegrated, opening up into the hotel's grand lobby, the exits, and the cold, chaotic air of the city street outside. 1. The world turned white as the electrical discharge hit the floor. The agents were thrown back by the EMP blast, their armor useless. In the ensuing panic and blinding static, I grabbed Chloe's hand and ran. We didn't stop for our coats, our bags, or our history. We burst through the shattered lobby doors and into the neon-soaked chaos of the midnight city, disappearing into the crowd before the dust had even begun to settle. I didn't look back at the Grand Hotel. I didn't look back at the life of the stepmother who knew nothing. As the sirens wailed in the distance and the first sparks of a systemic collapse began to light up the skyline, I let go of Chloe's hand, handed her a small encrypted key card, and looked her in the eye. "You wanted to know who I am?" I said, my voice blending into the noise of the city. "I'm the person who taught you how to live in a world of lies. Now, it's time to learn how to survive in the truth." I turned the corner and vanished into the subway station, leaving behind the only person who knew my secret, and a world that would spend the rest of its history wondering where the architect had gone. I was finally, blissfully, a nobody, and for the first time in my life, I was free.